Yeah, welcome back to the channel. Today we focus on genetics and inheritance. Now, this is only going to be an introduction to genetics and inheritance. We're not going to go into details. In order to be able to understand this topic, though, it is important to understand the 8 terminologies that I have listed in the screen. First of all, we're going to look at the idea of a gene and an allele. These are very closely related terminologies that mean very different things, and we're going to focus on that. We're going to look at the idea of dominant as well as recessive alleles. We're also going to look at the idea of phenotypes as well as genotype. And then lastly, we're going to look at homozygous versus heterozygous. That is going to be our focus for today. Let's get started. Let's look at a gene and an allele. What is the difference between a gene and an allele? The formal definition of a gene is said that a gene is a section of DNA, so not the entire thing, just a part. So a gene is a section of DNA that codes for a particular trait or a particular characteristic. So if we have the double helix shape of DNA, as I've tried to draw there, and I decide to take a section of that DNA molecule. The section that I've separated here is what we call a gene, right? So not the entire DNA molecule, just a section, just a part of the DNA is what we refer to as the gene. Now, this section of DNA is what we refer to as a gene. It is the actual unit of heredity. This tells us that when an offspring inherits characteristics from parents, these characteristics are inherited through what we call a gene. And this gene is a section of DNA coding for a particular characteristic, right? Now, let's go to allele. Now, an allele is said to be the alternate form of a gene that controls the same trait but in different ways. So when a single gene is being expressed in different ways, we say that is an allele. But these terminologies as they are very vague. So let's try to come up with an example to try and make them more clear. Let's say in plants, a plant can either be tall or it can be short, right? Now, when a tall plant is crossed with a short plant, all the offspring that they produce are going to be tall. Let's work with this statement. So a plant can either be tall or it can be short. When a tall plant is crossed with a short plant, all the offspring that they produce are going to be tall. Let's try and analyze this statement. So in these plants, the main characteristic that we're interested in here, it is their height. That is the main trait that we're interested in, it is the height, right? Now, we're going to describe the gene in terms of the characteristic that is going to be investigated. So the gene that is under investigation in this scenario, it is a gene for height, right? So we're going to describe the gene in terms of the characteristic being investigated. So because in these plants we're interested in their height, we're going to say that the gene under investigation here, it is the gene for height, right? So the gene here describes the trait as a whole. But the very same gene, the very same characteristic can be expressed in different ways, which is why we're going to say that a plant can either be tall or a plant can either be short. So the very same characteristic, which is height, this is our main characteristic, can be expressed in different ways. And when we express the same gene or when we express the same characteristic in different ways, that is when it becomes an allele. So an allele is a gene. It is just that it controls the same characteristic in different ways. So that is the difference between a gene and an allele. Let's continue. Now let's come to the idea of how alleles are expressed. Now, alleles can either be dominant or they can be recessive. Let's continue with the example that we made. Remember, we said that plants can be tall or they can be short. Now, when a tall plant is crossed with a short plant, we said that all the offspring are going to be tall. In this example, there was fertilization between this tall plant and this short plant, and all the offspring that were produced were tall. This somehow tells us that the characteristic for tallness is stronger than the characteristic for shortness. Hence, all the offspring that are produced are tall. So shortness is weaker to tallness in this statement, right? So when we look at the idea of alleles being dominant or alleles being recessive, an allele that is said to be dominant, in simple terms, we're going to say this is the stronger allele. This is the stronger allele. And an allele that is recessive, we're going to say it is the weaker allele. So in this sense, if I were to ask you what the dominant allele was, it was the allele that is going to win in this scenario, and that is the allele for tallness. This therefore tells us that the allele for tallness is dominant to the allele for shortness in this example. So because when a tall plant is crossed with a short plant, all the offspring are always tall, it therefore tells me that the short trait, the short allele, is recessive. It is weaker. So every time when a dominant allele is crossed with a recessive allele, the dominant allele will always win, right? So I often find myself making very, very silly examples in class, and I'm going to try and do the same with you. Let's say I'm going to give you 200 rands. Let's say I'm going to give you 200 rands, and I ask you to bet on a wrestling match. And this is a match between the Big Show and Rey Mysterio, right? If I were to ask you to bet that 200 rands, there's a very big chance that you are going to bet on Big Show to win. And that is quite simply because he's larger and therefore we'd imagine that he's stronger, right? So in this sense, we're going to say Big Show is dominant to Rey Mysterio. So in this fight, we're going to say that Big Show is always going to win. That is a very simple example to help you understand what is going on here, right? So let's come back to these dominant and these recessive alleles. Now, we are going to use letters to represent these alleles. And for the dominant trait, we are going to use capital letters. And for the recessive trait, we are going to use small letters. But which letters do we use? Which letters do we choose? For the dominant trait, we are going to look at the dominant characteristic here. The dominant characteristic is tallness. And the word tall simply starts with T. So the letter that we're going to choose to represent the allele for tallness, we're going to use capital letter T. So anytime I see capital letter T, I know T is the allele representing tallness. I will know that T is the allele that is representing tallness. But which letter do I choose to represent shortness, which is our recessive trait? Now I'll come and see that the word short simply starts with an S. But it is not allowed for me to represent the allele for shortness as small letter s. It is not allowed. We are going to use the small letter for the capital letter that we chose to represent the dominant characteristic. So since we chose capital letter T to represent tallness, we are simply going to use small letter t to represent shortness. We are going to use small letter t to represent shortness. So it tells me that every time that I see capital letter T, I will know that this is the allele for tallness. And every time I see small letter t, this will be the allele for shortness, right? So let's continue again. Now we come to phenotype and genotype. What is a phenotype? The phenotype is the physical appearance of an organism. This simply tells us that a phenotype is what you are going to be able to see. When you look at this particular organism, what do you see? And what you see is what we describe as the phenotype, that is the physical appearance. But when we come to the genotype is the genetic makeup of these organisms. Now, we do not see the genotype. What we do see is the phenotype, but the genotype determines the phenotype, right? So the genotype is the genetic makeup of these organisms. But when we represent this genotype, we're going to use two alleles. So this statement tells us this: each and every characteristic is controlled by two alleles. Let's go back to our example. We were talking about a tall plant and a short plant in which all the offspring here were tall, right? So each and every single trait is controlled by two alleles. So let's talk about this tall plant. We know that the allele that we chose to represent tallness is capital letter T. But we cannot represent the genotype for tallness as just capital letter T. That will be incorrect. It requires two letters, right? So for example, let's say that it is capital letter T, capital letter T. One might ask, why do we use two alleles? Why do we use two letters to write a genotype? This is simply because one of the letter is inherited from the paternal origin, that is, it is from the father. And the second allele is inherited from the maternal origin, that is, that it is from the mother, right? So for this plant to be tall, for example, it tells us that it must receive an allele from the father and it must also receive an allele from the mother. Therefore, when these two alleles interact together, they form what we call a genotype. Hence, we're saying that each and every single characteristic is controlled by two alleles. One allele from the paternal origin and the other allele from the maternal origin. Let's look at another example for tallness. Let's go back to this example for tallness and shortness, giving us offspring that are all tall. Let's say these tall plants did indeed bring that capital letter T to the offspring. But remember, we said that for shortness, we're going to use small letter t. So this parent that is short will contribute to that offspring, small letter t. Now, what will be the phenotype of this offspring? This is very easy to come up with an answer, because we said that capital letter T is the allele for tallness, and the small letter t is the allele for shortness. But here's a very simple formula. Every time when we combine a capital letter and a small letter, the capital letter will always win. So capital letter T here is for tallness. Small letter t is for shortness. But since capital letter T is stronger or is dominant to these allele for shortness, it tells us that the phenotype of this individual will be tall. The capital letter will always win, and therefore the effects of the recessive allele in this sense are going to be masked. We are not going to see shortness in this plant. It is going to be tall, simply because the dominant trait will always win if it is paired with a recessive trait. Again, one allele from the paternal origin, the other allele, it is coming from the maternal origin. Hence, we are saying that the genotype determines the phenotype. Let's look at our original example here of capital letter T and capital letter T. What will be the phenotype of these individuals? We know that capital letter T is the allele for tallness, and capital letter T is also the allele for tallness. It tells us that this plant is also going to be what? It is going to be tall. What about small letter t and small letter t? Let's take an example where one parent from the paternal origin contributed small letter t, and the maternal origin parent also contributed small letter t. If we have this genotype, what will be the phenotype of the offspring? It is also simple to tell, because small letter t is the allele for shortness. Small letter t is also the allele for shortness. It tells us that this plant is going to be short. Tells us that that plant is going to be short. Now, there's a very simple observation to make here. For the recessive trait to be expressed, the genotype must be made of two recessive alleles. Because if the genotype is not made of two recessive alleles, like it is the case in this example, then the dominant trait will always win. So for the recessive trait to be expressed, the genotype must be made of two recessive alleles. Let's continue. Now, genotype can be what we call homozygous, or a genotype can be what we call heterozygous. What does homozygous mean? The word homo, this word homo will simply mean same, and the word hetero will simply mean different, right? Will simply mean different. But remember, homozygous and heterozygous simply try to describe the state of the genotype. So if we're saying that a genotype is homozygous, we're saying that this genotype is going to be made of the same alleles. It is going to be made of identical alleles, which will represent as letters. So let's come up with an example of a genotype that is homozygous. So for tallness, I can give you capital letter T, capital letter T. This genotype is homozygous, and that is simply because it is made up of two identical letters. That is, it is made of capital letter T and capital letter T, so it is homozygous. But we also have small letter t, small letter t. This is also homozygous because it is made of identical letters. That is, it is made of small letter t, small letter t. So in this sense, it is homozygous. What about heterozygous? Heterozygous, it is going to be capital letter T, small letter t. So these are different versions of the same letter. So we're going to say it is heterozygous because we're going to use capital letter T and small letter t. So they are not the same. So it is heterozygous. When they are the same, capital letter T, they are homozygous. When they are the same, small letter t, they are also homozygous. But when they are different, capital letter T and small letter t, we say they are heterozygous, irrespective of the fact that they are all T's, but the fact that we're going to use a capital letter and a small letter tells us that they are different, hence they are heterozygous, right? But let's look at this example. Let's look at capital letter T, capital letter T. This is what we call homozygous. This is what we call homozygous dominant. This is what we call homozygous dominant. Remember, the word homo means same. Dominant, we know that when we talk about an allele that is dominant, we use capital letters. So the fact that we use two capital letter T's tells us that, number one, it is homozygous. And the fact that they are both capital letters tells us that they are dominant. So when we describe this genotype, we're going to say it is simply homozygous dominant. But when we look at small letter t, this is what we're going to say is homozygous. This is what we're going to say is homozygous recessive. This is what we're going to say is homozygous recessive. Again, it is homozygous simply because it is made up of the very same letters. So it is small letter t, small letter t. So in this sense, it is homozygous. But because they are all small letters, it tells us that they are what we call recessive. So in this sense, small letter t, it is homozygous recessive. But for capital letter T, small letter t, it is still heterozygous. Now, there's a few information to add in the sense that an organism that is homozygous can also be called what we call a pure breed. It is also what we call a pure breed. So the word pure breed will simply mean homozygous. For heterozygous, an organism can be said to be what is called a hybrid. Can be called what we call a hybrid. So a hybrid simply means heterozygous. Pure breed simply means homozygous. This is an introduction to genetics, and if you understand these terminologies, you're not going to have any problem with the topic. and it carries a lot of marks. So it is very important to understand these terminologies. Until next time, bye-bye.